back to Defence Talks, Securing the UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. Every 2 weeks, our podcast discusses key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK and explores the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. Over the last 2 decades, nations have needed to counter a dramatic increase in the number and types of threats to their national defence and security. Disruptive technologies, including artificial intelligence and new quantum-based technologies, can add to these challenges, but can also offer significant opportunities to improve defence and security capability. In this week's episode, we will examine what emerging disruptive technologies are and why are they significant in today's geopolitical environment before considering how these technologies are likely to progress in the years to come. I am William Freer, Research Fellow in National Security at the Council on Geostrategy, and today I'll be standing in for Victoria to introduce you to this week's episode. And we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Rob Merriweather, James Gavin, and Robert Fox. Rob Merriweather is the Group Technology Director at BAE Systems. His role involves ensuring the effective utilisation of technology across the company and looking to increase collaboration both internally and externally. James Gavin is the head of the Future Capability Group at Defence Equipment and Support at the Ministry of Defence. His team exists to help explore new capabilities so that they can be exploited at scale. Robert Fox, MBE, is the Defence and Security Editor at the Evening Standard and a writer for the New European. Robert has been a journalist for 56 years, working with a number of outlets including the BBC, Sky, ITV and LBC. I'll now hand over to Robert Fox, who will kick off our discussion with Rob and James.
Yes, welcome to this podcast where the subject is emerging disruptive technologies. Can I start first of all with you, James? Simple definition. Emerging disruptive technology. Do we mean drones, just drones, or drones and a lot more?
I think it has to be drones and a lot more, really, because I kind of see them in things that are important today. You know, you go to war with what you have, but you've got other disruptive technologies on the horizon, like quantum, for example, which could potentially solve a lot of the difficulties that we face caused by electronic warfare, for example. So I see a whole pipeline of emerging disruptive technologies.
I mean, it's clearly a much wider suite, and I tend to think of these things as what are the technologies that aren't just an evolution that allow us to evolve how we act the way we do today, but what are the things that open up genuinely new possibilities or new threats that we need to defend against. So for me, the emerging it's new. The disruptive is it changes how we go about doing what it is we're going to do, whether that's warfighting in this context, or whether that's how we navigate our cars in a commercial context. But the things that fundamentally change how we look at the problem space and the technologies that enable that.
Could you draw down some examples that we have seen? Let's take Ukraine.
Yeah, I think Ukraine's fascinating. For those that studied the Cold War in the 1980s, you can really see, for example, the impact that air defences have had on the use of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft going forward. You know, helicopters have virtually been removed from the battlefield and replaced to a large degree by ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance drones, but also by long-range fires and the use of in the close and the far battle space by small first-person view drones all the way through to one-way attack drones. So you can't just look at these emerging disruptive technologies in isolation. You have to sort of look in reality about how they've been deployed and the impacts they've had. Armed helicopters were disruptive 30, 40 years ago. The US Department of Defense have just pulled back from investing in new helicopters for the US Army, for example. So I think there's a whole myriad of things to consider when we're sort of talking about disruptive technologies.
I'm sorry, just to pursue you down that, could you continue with very advanced attack helicopters like the iterations of the Apache, if they could stand off sufficient distance, or are they still vulnerable?
Yeah, I think those kind of capabilities definitely have something to add to the battle space. And I think, particularly if you're not fighting a near-peer adversary, the Apaches could dominate a battlefield. And having the ability to stand off and fire further and use those exotic sensors that they carry is going to be very important. So I think in that battlefield sense, we'll probably see a shift to even longer range weaponry for those platforms.
Of course, looking at the problems of drone warfare, where does autonomy fit? This is along with AI, it is one of the buzzwords, and it is really a very difficult thing for the public to grasp as to where we're going with autonomy. Can I ask you both in turn about that? Is it a way round drone warfare, the kind of thing that you have something that is autonomous without getting the crazy spectrum of killer robots?
So autonomy that you see on the TV, we're potentially 50 to 100 years away from robots running around the battlefield on their own. Countering electronic warfare for navigation, so GPS that we have in our cars, on our phones, it is being countered by electronic warfare. So we are starting to look at using more powerful computer chips, edge computing as it's called, enabling AI on small drones to use sort of visual cues to where they are and where they're going. But it's only to assist the operators. One thing they've seen is first-person view drones, and in part they're being used because autonomy that comes from GPS-enabled systems is not working. It's quite easy to jam. Whereas the signals, the complex waveform signals that are being used to control first-person view drones, the operators are able to see their way to a target, following a road, just like a person would if they're flying this small aircraft. So that's been one way to counter it, but that's very expensive in terms of people, and eventually will be jammed itself. So having edge compute with AI that can find its way along a map is potentially one of those ways to counter it. We are experimenting in the battlefield with that type of capability, still yet to be proven, but AI improves all the time. That's what it's about. It is supposed to learn.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think when you look at that next stage, it's almost ironic that we've gone from something that could navigate autonomously, but it's not really autonomous because it's taking its signals from an offboard system. That gets jammed, so we bring a person into the loop, but that's another offboard control. As James says, ultimately that will be able to be jammed. But it's also important, I think, jamming isn't digital. Jamming restricts the bandwidth. It makes it difficult to get information through. You can get less information through, but it doesn't just flip a switch and suddenly I can't talk to anything at all. So for me, the next iteration on the autonomy scale, the intelligence, is how do you do more of the hard work on board? So how do you get the navigation, the object classification for the drone to itself know what it's looking at? So then it just needs to send a much simpler package of information back, which can be more resilient to jamming, and that iteration. But the thing that we always focus on very, very strongly is how we separate the intelligence from the authority. So can we make the drone as intelligent as possible to understand as much of its environment as possible, but it still doesn't have the authority to act? That authority is with the human operator. And in that way, if we can put more intelligence on the drones, we can make them more resilient to jamming because they can do more of their function organically within the bounds of the platform, but then still maintain that critical authority piece back to the operators.
Yeah, and that I think that critical authority in terms of the UK and our ethics is fundamentally at the core of everything we do. However, at one end of the spectrum, I'm actually not worried about that being lost with other countries using AI, because AI is not as useful as people might think. In terms of people being worried about AI running amok, it really isn't. It's just not going to be there for a very, very long time. It is all about assisting the operator, and I think that's why decisions have to be embedded in that system.
So we are still talking about that contested airspace at depth, and particularly even over the line of contact, over the front line, which it seems to me that's where the battle is being won and lost so much. Does this obviate systems like main battle tanks, if you are insufficiently inoculated, if I can put it like that, with countermeasures against attack drones?
Yeah, I think the combined arms narrative that we've had for many years, multiple levels of defence, is really important for understanding. Just sending a tank with a few soldiers forwards is going to be very vulnerable. Having multiple different layers of defence and offensive capability linked to that tank become even more important now.
Rob, you're looking at the future. You're looking at the immediate present and then out to the future. how has the kind of thing that James has been mentioning, the change of the conception of the battle space, including the contact battle, how is this affecting the way your mind is going, the way you're directing your approach to these emerging technologies?
Well, ultimately, as part of the defence industrial base, our role is to support our nations and governments and our allies in having the capabilities they need to address these challenges that James is describing. So as the challenges evolve, and we tend to learn new things about new specific scenarios in each new conflict, then that naturally sparks that innovation, that problem solving. If that's the challenge, what's the solution? What's the arms race between the challenge we're seeking and the capability that we need to offer to provide that? I think some things that are coming out from the current situation is that pace needs to move forwards at an order of magnitude faster than at any other time. The evolution of threat that we faced through the Cold War was relatively static. There was then a burst of learning when we had the conflicts in Iraq. There's then a burst of different learning when we have the conflict in Afghanistan. We're now having another burst of learning, albeit more sustained and more intense and at a higher pace, all play into the problem solving that we in the defence industrial base try to support. I think there's a really interesting interplay that comes between the equipments, the capabilities, and the tactics.
Yeah.
So as we see tactics evolve, either from our own forces or from our adversaries, how does that play into that cycle? And that kind of talks to the joint arms piece that James was thinking of. So we look at fundamentally, where does the status quo not meet the need? Because there are many areas where actually the status quo does meet the need. We have lots of equipment that's proving highly effective. Things like Archer with mobile artillery is highly effective equipment. But then where are the gaps? And those gaps appear in multiple places. So some of them, they are disruptive emerging technologies, but in things like the advanced manufacturing space. So the rapid increase in the use of artillery has driven shortages in the energetics of the explosives for the rounds and for the propellants. How do we reinvent how to restock that? How do we think about the manufacturing processes that allow that to be done at pace, potentially even deployable solutions so we don't have to build huge stockpiles? So you get that category of kind of enabling emerging disruptive technology. And then we get into things, if we probably pick the drones, which are a really key learning ground at the moment. At the start of the Ukraine conflict, that was all about how many drones can I field in the minimum time possible. Then the countermeasures start to come in, the EW starts to come up, they become less effective. How can we make these things more resilient? We talk a lot, we've talked about affordable combat mass as being one of the main things that's driven out of Ukraine. I think for us as a company, we tend to add the word resilient in there. So how do you get to affordable, resilient combat mass? And that becomes a trade space as soon as you bring that in, because you can make something exquisite and expensive and then it isn't delivering combat mass. Or you can make something incredibly cheap but it has very little resilience and its effectiveness is short-lived. So how we look at that problem is often around how we optimize those trade spaces given the constraints and the conflicts and the specific environments that we're being asked to consider.
When you're talking about mass, you must have been looking back before Ukraine to Iraq, the final ousting at a great cost of ISIS from Mosul, for example, where cheap mass drones were used and very effectively by the adversary. So we read through there, and I'm very struck by your agility in that, yes, you're talking about Ukraine, but let's not think about Ukraine, because you can do extraordinary things below the level of sophistication, sub-sophistication. Look what the Houthis have been doing. And this is the way that we're going to have to learn. But is it just a question of pace that has taken us by surprise with Ukraine? For instance, beginning, all praise to the Bayraktar T2 of Turkish design. They're about as useful, as you were saying, James, as a standard Apache helicopter now over the close combat zone.
Yeah.
So Has this taken you by surprise?
I don't think it's taken us totally by surprise, because I think what we're seeing is an evolving battlefield, linking to what Rob has said about countermeasures and countermeasures. I think it's not the most exquisite UAV platform. It was kind of mid-range, but it's quite large. So what we've seen a shift towards is smaller but longer range ISR drones that have managed to lever emerging technology on multiple fronts, better batteries, for example, where the energy density is getting stronger and stronger, which allows you to fly, battery powered drones further than, where previously you'd have had to have a larger drone. The payloads are getting smaller, electronics are getting smaller, more software defined systems are coming in. So the footprint of the ISR vehicles that are flying over Ukraine is far smaller than before. So, but also at the same time, it's cheaper and more effective to make one-way attack drones. So why have an armed drone when you can just send a one-way attack drone to do the mission? So I think that sort of leveraging multiple angles of technology in the same way that mobile phones became, modern smartphones became more viable, is that pivots across to the military world as well, as we're sort of doing that counter approach, if that makes sense.
Can you both talk a bit about ingenuity, innovation actually on the battlefront, which has been spectacular by the Ukrainians, but not exclusively by them. The other side have shown great capacity and innovation. Is there a takeaway, first of all, from a government D&S point of view?
Yeah, so I mean, it probably won't surprise you to know that on the back of the conflict, but the need to modernise, to be better and better, faster than our adversaries. The organisation I work for, Defence Equipment Support, is reorganising to help enable that. My team in particular have been trialling out different ways of working, linked to spiral development, linked to the integrated procurement model that was recently announced, about how we can respond quicker but also better at the same time. So, for example, we're going out on drones to industry with more outcome-focused needs rather than detailed requirements. We're funding 2 or 3 companies to develop to a minimum viable product, and then funding a few of those to get to a minimum viable capability, and then we're funding 1 to win, produce stuff at a scale. But we're also then that one that's won to produce at scale, we're funding them to spirally develop, linked to feedback directly from the front line. So one example that I can talk about direct with Rob here is Malloy, recently acquired by BAE Systems, where we're funding them not just buying batches of their capabilities, but we're actually funding them to spirally develop and improve that capability, frontline to factory to frontline, which is a really interesting term I heard a few days ago, because you can't have traditionally where we have senior users or senior responsible owners between you and the frontline user. You've got to have industry talking as close as we can to that front line to improve their products based on direct feedback.
Spiral development.
Yep.
To my grandma, long gone, but how would you explain it? Because it is an absolutely key and crucial concept now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the concept is relatively simple. It's how do you put a capability in the field, and then how do you incrementally add functionality and capability to that? So how do we, keep the guts of the structure of the drone the same, but put a new software load on that allows it to navigate with more accuracy, or to perform a different mission because it can now do better object classification, or you do an integration spiral where it can now take a different weapon, or it can take a different EW system, or it has a new jamming or jam resistant navigation solution on top of it. So it's how to keep 90% of what you have but incrementally add to the functionality and the capability. And the really important thing about it is that's not just about, if I start at position A and I know I want to be at position B, how do I give somebody A first and I'll incrementally get them to B? It's about giving them A where we don't know where B is yet. But after they've used it for 3 months, then they're going to know what they want and what they need and where the gaps are and what the problems are. So it's that agility of the final capability that is the real benefit of spiral development. Yes, it gets you something faster, which is also critically important. But for me, the real value proposition is you haven't set the die on what your final capability is at the point where you order it. You're giving the end user that flexibility to iterate and innovate.
I have to ask you both the mischievous question. Does this get round the old charge, the old lie, as it were, of exquisite technology? There are certain defence chiefs past no names, no pack drill, who loved banging on, oh, we shouldn't have this. Usually it was an army person talking about the Navy talking about the Air Force or the RAF. Oh, that is exquisite technology. This beats that argument, doesn't it? And then you say this is in development. This is what we're looking at. And it means, sorry, in the old-fashioned Fleet Street jargon, it has legs.
I would say it sits alongside it.
Yeah.
And again, if I talk about the range of geopolitical environments that we're talking about, with what we're setting off to do with AUKUS Pillar 1 and collaborative nuclear submarine development with Australia, that is going to be a long development with reasonable certainty on capability of an exquisite piece of military capability. What this is a different approach to solving a different need. And for me, they complement each other. And there is always the trade space about how exquisite something becomes. James and I were talking before this started around combat mass, and the concept that if you've got a defence budget the size of the US, you can actually afford exquisite combat mass. You can have a lot of stuff that's really good, but when you hit that trade space, how much capability do you put in? How much cost does that drive? Is that cost valuable against the mission set, or are you better having more of the simple thing? And these things are never one end of the spectrum or the other. Somewhere in the middle, there's an optimal place, and we learn that optimal through end users using the equipment. And spiral development gives us a much better chance of landing up in the right place.
James, exquisite technology, combat mass, and what's in between? What's in between, whom we haven't mentioned, very crucial, is the fighting man and woman on the front line. They're the operator, and we've been at some very big and very effective defence conferences in this current month, running up to the election, not because of it. But what is so interesting is the experience and the evolution of the fighting combat individual, because it is as likely, look at Ukraine, look at some of the really brilliant innovative stuff that's being done, and in our own armed services by women alongside men. But how much are we putting a premium on them as operators, feeding back in your loop to both of you, operating with skill, innovating, and then getting it back to saying this is the direction that we need to go?
It's definitely the way forward. So I think really learning from software development, something called agile with a big A, the agile values and principles at the end of the day are all about getting the user requirements as close as we can to the people building the software. So we've been really learning from that about how we put that into the physical world, and we are definitely going to have to think in terms of the Ministry of Defence about how we can get that feedback better from our own soldiers, sailors and air people, I think I have to say, rather than airmen. And it's going to be a real challenge for us because we've got ways of working that have developed over the last 70 or 80 years in terms of having a hierarchical structure, whereas actually where the chief sets what the requirement is and that filters down. Whereas actually today, the modern ways of working in terms of software, it's the consumers bottom up who feed that. So I think we always will have to have, we can't just democratize everything bottom up. But we are going to have to factor that a new way of working in there about how we get the feedback from the frontline soldiers, sailors, etc.
The best commanders I've worked alongside in 4 or 5 campaigns, and I've worked in anti-terror and anti-organised crime campaigns in Italy by very brave officers, have been brilliant exponents without tugging the forelock doctrine, have been operators of mission command. The very best was General Sir Rupert Smith, still with us, successful in 4 major operations, and it was empowering at the bottom level to take initiative. Do you think that there's a problem in trust and education at that level? Are we asking too much of our girls and boys on the front line?
I don't think we are actually. There's a really good writer Richard Rummelt, who wrote the book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and I think embedded within this, he doesn't say it is that whole mission command idea, because what he says that the leaders need to do is to identify what the blockers are, which have been fed bottom up as well as top down, what the opportunities are, what some guiding policies are, and what the strategic actions, and you can get all that on a page. Gone are the days of 80-page strategies. Yeah. If you can put the opportunities, the blockers, the guiding policies, and I think that's where the leadership really steps in, and the expectations from strategic actions, and you tell your leaders that work with and for you and their teams. You set the expectations, you set the narrative. What I've seen responding from my teams from doing that is they know where the boundaries are, they know what they're expected to do, but also you use those few things to hold them to account, and that drives the culture and the behaviours. So I think we will see, again, as part of that DNS reorganisation, we're going to see a lot more of that type of leadership filtering down. So your senior people are more like servant leadership, if you heard that term before. That's going to be a real transition, because at the end of the day, the armed forces are hierarchical in their structure and nature, and it's been that way for thousands of years. But for capability development and pushing those emerging technologies, we need to work that way more. And in part, the reason we need to work that way more is because we're going to be leveraging, and we are leveraging, civil technologies more and more. You can't do that from a traditional structured World War II type way of working. You have to accept the more digital democratization that's there to empower people to innovate.
Yeah. Rob,
I'll say
from your point of view, I think it's fascinating now, your relationship with the operators, and what would you expect of them, and what should they expect of you? Putting stuff in the field, quick turnaround.
Ultimately, from my perspective, what the operators should expect from us is our genuine best endeavours to solve the challenges that are being highlighted to us. That's fundamentally, as a defence industrial base, what we're there to do, and that's what they should expect us to do, and that's what we should be held account to deliver. I think a couple of points to pick up on what James was saying, which are things that can really, really help. One, I think the freedom of action that comes from the identification of clear boundaries is huge. If you can just say something, so long as you stay within this area, you are absolutely free to innovate. The freedom and the motivation and the creativity that spawns is massive. So we're using that within the company, within our investment programs, within how we manage some of the businesses that we're seeking to acquire, to maintain that maximum freedom of action. If you take Malloy as an example, our integration strategy for Malloy is very much protect the maximum amount of what made them successful, because they're delivering, they're performing. So that comes first. Then we say, how do we add something to that allows them to be more effective or more capable? James and I had this conversation a week ago. We can invest more to protect lead time in the supply chain than Malloy could before they were acquired. BAE Systems has deeper pockets than Malloy. We can take more risk on long lead material. So that's just a clear added value activity that we can do. It's really simple. It doesn't change the structure, but it makes them more effective at delivering that end use case. So that freedom of action from boundaries is really key. The other thing that I'd like to come back to, you talked about agile. And by this there is a formal definition of what we mean by agile as a methodology for software development, becoming used more and more in broader development outside of software. But the real thing that agile offers us in the context of this conversation is you start requirements in the agile process with a story. You start with a user story that is a user saying, I want to be able to do this. Now, that's the kind of thing that is reasonable and realistic to extract from the users and the operators on the front line. Just say, tell me a story about what you want to do. And then that gets captured. And then we bring those back and we say, okay, well, I've got these 15 stories of these people who want to do these 15 different things. And then we can get the engineers on and go, well, actually, those 15 stories, actually, they're 20 features. And if I do these 5 features, you can do those 10 stories. So let's focus on those first. And you go back and answer 10. But you're not relying on the people at the front end to write requirements in old-fashioned speak. You're just saying, tell us the stories of the functionality and the capability you want. And then that gives us the starting point to then work with, with MOD or MOD to flow down to us in industry to say, this is what I want a solution to. How do we meet these as quickly as possible?
Let's continue a little on Ukraine, because you've both drawn out such wonderful examples and inference lessons from this. But seeing in a military hierarchical system, which has to have discipline at the core of it, fire control, etc. How do you incorporate what you've just said from the civilian side, the thing that Rob has talked about, you have the stories and you know what you want to do, and this is what's concentrating and making our eyes water on the front line at Kharkiv or whatever at the moment. But what Rob seems to be saying to me, and from your civilian guy who's coming in the flip-flops and T-shirts, I don't mean to say, but I've just had an idea overnight. Have you thought about? And it's getting the have you thought about. Some of them will be, Churchill was the great exponent of that, of course, and most of his ideas were completely lousy. But some of them were genius. How can we bring that into the system, into the creative system?
Yeah, I think it's definitely about the culture, but I think it's about at multiple levels in a hierarchy, people being very aware what the key performance indicators are that you're after. And if it's about deploying capability into operations that can make a difference, that's very different to a mentality which is it's all about science and technology. Which isn't linked to that operational need. I think things have changed from where it's okay to do a lot of innovation tourism, a lot of innovation theatre because we're spread betting. And I think what we are doing now is being very clear to people that was the noughties, post the end of the Cold War. It was fine to go out and spread bet, but now really we're going to have to focus. If you're doing science and technology, there needs to be a return on investment there. It might fail, but you've got to fail fast, to use a software term there. But the other things need to succeed, and you need to be razor focused on getting things through that minimum viable product to minimum viable capability and into the hands of the user, and then iterating. That whole narrative, I think, is one that most people can understand.
Can I make a point on that spread betting? Because I think this is important when you look across the whole ecosystem as well of the extended defence industrial base. The venture capitalist community will still spread bet.
Yeah.
So that broad innovation, well, this might work. Let's just give it a go. That can happen without direct government, kind of intervention, to be honest. But where it then becomes critical is how to link the things out of that evolutionary model that look like they might succeed to the problem statements that James is saying he's prioritised. And that, I think, is a key role of industry, to be able, and the larger industries that have the engagements and understand that context, so to go, okay, I now know that this is a clear priority. Okay, out of these 10 startups, sorry you 9 VCs, you back the wrong horse, but that one, that's got a link. So, James's team doesn't have to do that spread betting. There are organisations who will do that. It's about getting the linkage and the pull through for the ones that do succeed to then be able to progress that. And by the way, when we do that really well, and the VCs see more of those organisations succeeding, they're more willing to invest in them. So you get a richer ecosystem to pull from. So understanding that end-to-end ecosystem and the role that each organisation plays in it is critical. We as big industry have a role in pulling some of that through. James has a role in setting the priorities and in pulling the success elements of that through into service. But it's all about understanding those layers and working through.
I don't mean to rain on the parade, but we just have to say this about Ukraine and, to an extent, the Houthis, and goodness knows what's going on with the technicals and the kind of warfare that's being employed in Sudan at the moment, not to say Myanmar, where we're seeing some sophistication. Are there some real takeaways that we should really be focusing on from the way Russia has conducted its war effort? They have, to use mass in a very crude and old-fashioned way, haven't they? And yet that they have shown in some aspects of technological innovation, particularly in the electromagnetic spectrum, they have shown real ingenuity and adaptability. James, what are the takeaways from looking at the other side?
Yeah, I think Russia's interesting because it's been very strong in electronic warfare for the last 50 years, and it's employed that very effectively. But I think if I was going to pivot that over, Ukrainians have shown an ability to pivot very quickly around that. I think whilst they have been dominating the battle space there, the Ukrainians have very quickly, to be frank, with Western help, have been able to counter that to quite a serious degree. And I think as well as electronic warfare, the Russians are throwing waves of people, waves of armour. But again, I think the counters, a lot of it was sort of developed in terms of NATO's thinking during the 80s has blunted that massively. Critical mass only takes you so far. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Rob, are there any particular takeaways you see the way the adversaries are operating across 2.5, 3.5 really very serious conflicts?
I think for me, if I look a little further forwards, and I'm not talking 10 years, but 2 or 3 years further forwards, the resilience of pure commercial technology will ultimately land up being defeated by an adversary who is trying to counter that, and largely that tends to happen in the electromagnetic domain, not exclusively, but largely. I think that then turns into an arms race of how do I make my GPS navigation more difficult to jam? How do I get better at jamming someone's GPS navigation? Or how do I make it even harder to jam? And you get into this arms race of escalating complexity and cost, which then takes you away from the combat mass piece that you were trying to achieve. So for me, the technologies that become really exciting are the ones that allow you to bring those capabilities genuinely on board to the platform. I talk about the EMC environment being an engineering arms race. We protect our ability to hear the GPS signals by exquisite engineering in the antenna, and we come up with better defeat mechanisms by coming up with exquisite waveforms that will blunt even these more exquisite antenna. Some of the quantum technologies offer us the opportunity to do this by defending ourselves by fundamental physics. It's not an engineering challenge, it's a fundamental physics challenge, and known physics does not have a mechanism to jam this device. It's not to say that the scientists won't find something and discover something, but as of today, it's unjammable. And then those kinds of technologies, if we can get those affordable such that they can deliver at sufficient mass, then you remove that arms race element because the physics isn't there to optimize. So that for me is kind of what I'm taking out of these conflicts, the rate of iteration, the rate of that arms race. Where are there opportunities to remove yourself from it and come up with something that is sufficiently fundamentally different that you deliver an enduring, resilient capability?
This draws this fascinating conversation to some kind of conclusion. It seems to me that we are entering a new dialogue between government, industry, the fighting arms.
Yeah, I think you're going to hear a lot more use of this following term. So you heard it here first, mission partnerships. Yeah. So we jointly understand what the mission is, and that's not just defence equipment support.
Dragonfire.
Yeah, so Dragonfire is a good example. We know what the outcome is, and we work closely with industry and academia and others to help move towards that mission. So you're going to definitely hear a lot more, and I think the motivation that the Russians are coming, as the head of the Swedish army briefed a few months before the Ukrainian invasion. The room was really surprised. When he briefed Twickenham at the International Armoured Vehicle Conference, and it genuinely was. The room was taken aback by hearing the head of the Swedish Army saying the Russians are coming, and the Russians were coming a few months later. But focusing on that mission about how we keep our country safe is really important to all of us. No, nobody works in defence because they're in it because it's easy. It is hard. Niche capability is hard to develop and to get to the front lines. But it's really worthwhile. So that term mission partnerships, you're going to hear a lot more of.
To conclude then, you've absolutely led beautifully there. But I've talked about grandma. Let's talk about our grandchildren. I have 2 granddaughters, I have a grandson. Why does it count?
I think it counts because all these cliches we talk about, least you forget history because history won't forget you. We don't want to have to go through World War II again. Yeah. We don't want to see the mass slaughter in Europe and death counts at one end of the spectrum. We don't want to see our children, our grandchildren dying in a war. And I think that really does come back to why we need to be talking, with a big stick, which we know is effective and sending very strong messages in terms of our capabilities and our ability to mobilise very quickly. UK industry has mobilised very, very quickly in terms of the capabilities that we're sending to the Ukraine. That message really does matter.
I would completely echo that. The quote that has resonated with me over the last 6 months is we're putting ourselves on a war footing so we don't need to go to war. It's that preparedness of the effectiveness of our ability to counter aggressive action. And if we can use the horrendous conflicts that are going on at the moment to make that case that this is not a viable strategy for our adversaries, such that it doesn't escalate, then certainly for me, that's why I'm in the role that I do. That's...
Thank you both very much. And of course, the old cliche has never been so true. We may not be interested in war, but war is interested in us. I can't refrain. I heard Professor Margaret Macmillan, great author of the Versailles Treaty, speak only a few days ago, and it reminds me of Clemenceau. War is far too serious a business to be left to the generals alone.
Thank you for listening to Defence Talks, Securing UK Advantage, brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ADS and sponsored by BAE Systems. If you would like to submit a question for our next episode, please email them to defencetalks@geostrategy.org.uk. You can find your upcoming podcast episodes on our website, and please visit www.geostrategy.org.uk/Defence Talks.